Okay, so today this video which I'm recording that pertains to some basic concepts that are related to another user defined data type which are called classes. Um, so we'll really be dealing with the terminology from this lecture onwards that relates to object oriented programming. So we'll have a data type which is called classes, which is just like structs, but there are some subtle differences between structs and classes. One of the main difference between structs and classes is that in case of structs, whenever you define a struct, unless specified, uh, all the variables and all the functions that are members of that struct, they are public in nature. That means that they are global, meaning that they are accessible from anywhere within the program. Whereas in case of classes, everything that is defined within a class, the, the way that you define members within a class is very similar to the way you define it in case of structs. The main difference is that everything by default in case of a class is private in nature. So that means that you cannot access them by using the dot notation directly, though indirect accessibility is available. Okay, so that's primarily the main difference between the two data types that we basically be discussing. Okay, so classes inherently are secure compared to structs. That means that the accessibility is limited, and that means that you have to have this default access specifier defined properly in order to make it accessible in your main program, and that is by making it public. Whereas in case of structs, if you want to restrict the accessibility, you write down the, the access specifier or modifier as private thing. So that's primarily the difference between these two. So access specifier in case of classes by default is private. And the first two slides on in the lecture slides that I've uploaded, these distinctions are actually made clear. In terms of syntax, the only difference between in terms of syntax, the difference would be that instead of using the keyword struct here, you will be using the keyword class here, and the rest is similar. So instead of struct point, as we discussed in some of the earlier examples, we'll be writing class point, and that would mean that all the properties of classes would primarily be applicable to the struct point, to the class defined as point, as shown in this slide. This is slide number 4 on the lecture notes that I've uploaded. So here there are two sets of members defined in this particular class. There is a set of private members with writing a keyword private here. You don't need to write this keyword private here because everything by default is private. Even if you don't write this keyword private, int x, int y, and print2 will be considered private. Whereas if you want to declare something public, you have to write down this keyword public here, which is written in red here, and under and below that you can write down the various functions that this class actually has. And they are all public functions. That means that you can access them through the dot notation and directly from the main program. You also have to keep this thing in mind that all the constructors that you define, whether they are default constructors or they are parameterized constructors, they fall in the category of public domain. The setters and the getters are also in the public domain because you are actually calling them from the main program. Now, why these setters and getters are used? Now, the discussion on classes will make it very clear because all the private members of a class are not accessible directly, and we have discussed under structs that all the private members can only be accessed through a function, and that function has to be a public function. Therefore, setters and getters are primarily used to set the value for the private members of a class and to get the values of the private members of the class. And constructors, you already know, that are used to initialize the values of the private members as well as You can use them to initialize the public members of the class. Okay, so here this very simple program which is shown on slide 4 of your notes of the lectures, you will see that there are two setter functions that are defined, two getter functions are defined, and one print function is defined in the public domain along with one constructor, which is default, a default constructor. Okay, it's not a parameterized constructor. Okay, so let's take a very simple example here and see that how the class functions would actually operate. So here I've got an IDE shared with you. I hope you can see this. And let me just write down a piece of code here, which actually uses the definition of the classes. Now, I'll just copy this bit here in the IDE, and we'll see that why that how these functions can actually be used. So we have these public functions defined here. Uh, Now you also need to know that in this particular representation, the private members are defined here. As I told you, don't need to write down line number 13. Even if it is not written, it would be considered private. 18 to 23 represent the definition of the constructors, as well as the setters and the getters, and which is print. Now you can see very clearly here the definition of these functions have not been defined within the class. So the class actually starts from this bracket and ends with this parenthesis on line number 24. So this is the class definition. Definitions of this set of these functions, they have not been defined within the definition or the declaration of the class itself. They have been defined outside the definition of the class, and that's why you'll see that this double dot notation has actually been used in this particular case. So this point, the first point would refer to the point class, which is represented here on line number 12, line number 11. And after the double dot notation, we have got the name of the function which we're going to define. So the name of the function that we are going to define now is the constructor, which has been initialized or which has been declared at line number 18 within the definition of the class. And you can see that this is a very simple sort of constructor that has been defined. It initializes the value to 0. Then the setter has been defined, which sets the value of x. Similarly, you can define other functions here. So we can define the setters for x and the setters for y. The setter for x has been defined here. The setter for y has been defined here. Again, you can see that the double dot notation has been used in this particular case because you are defining these functions outside the class definition. So you have to actually write down the name of the class for which these functions have been defined. So the syntax would go like this. You will have the return type followed by the name of the class for which these functions are to be written, followed by the double dot notation, followed by the name of the function, right? So this is the syntax that you actually use in this particular case. Okay, so all these functions have been defined. Remember, print2 function has also been defined, which is primarily outside, which is primarily a private member of the of the of the class. Okay, if you see the definition of the class itself. So now we'll write down the main program. There are various commands that have been written in the main program. So the first command is p.x. Okay, here line number 59, point p has been defined. Now p here will be considered as an object of the class. So now an instance of a class or an object of the class. So the object actually inherits or gets all the properties that are associated with that particular class. So it's considered to be a variable that has been defined against the data type class. As we define an instance of a struct, similarly here we have defined an object of a class which is called p. And because this x here is as a private member, therefore what should happen here in this line number 60 is that p.x should not should not be compiled. The reason is that X is a private member and you cannot access it directly from the main program. You have to use a function, and that means that you have to use a function in order to get this value p dot x. And for that particular case, you can actually use the getter function or the getter. So in order to get the value of x, you will have to use the function get x. Okay, you can't directly use line number 60 directly. You can't write this because x is the private member. So the object using the dot notation, p object using the dot notation will give you an error. Okay. Similarly, line number 62 will give you an error. Line number 63 will give you an error in this particular case. Okay. Now, okay, right. So this primarily will give you an error. So if you compile this program, you will see. I'll just. I mean, this program can be found on slide number 7 of your lectures, and you can see that. Let me just run this program, and you will see that what happens in this particular case. Okay. So of course it says that p dot x is not acceptable here. So you can comment out this line. Similarly, you can comment out this line. Similarly, you can comment out this line. Whereas the setters, the two setters, and the print function, because print is a function that is in the public domain. Okay, so that's in the public domain. Therefore, you can use the dot notation. Get x के लिए भी dot notation use की जा सकती है. Set x के लिए भी, set y के लिए भी, and get y के लिए भी dot notation can actually be used. Okay, so let's just see कि print 2 आपने call किया है यहाँ पे. तो let me just run this piece of code now, and this piece of code will work perfectly. And there is no issue here because आप public function को call कर रहे हैं through the dot notation. You are setting the value of x and you are setting the value of y. You are calling a function which is print 2. Okay, अगर आपने print not print 2, in fact print, अगर आपने print 2 को call करना है तो it has to be called through a public function. So let's just call print 2 from within print. Okay, so let me just write down here print 2 and let's call this print 2. और print 2 को मैं I'll just change the contents which are present in print 2 ताकि हमें पता चल सके कि print 2 has actually been called. Okay, so I can say that print 2 called through print. Okay, so let me just run this piece of code now. And because we are calling this print 2 function using through the print function where print is public and print 2 is private. Okay, so this should generate the required output, and you can see that print 2 has been called in this particular case, and the statement which we have written in print 2 has actually been printed. Okay. So just the opposite things are happening in this particular case. For example, in case of structs, everything is public. In case of classes, everything is private in nature unless specified. So let's just see कि क्या ये private hold करता है या नहीं hold करता private. So let me just comment this part out, and let me just try to run p dot x here. Okay, so let me just run p dot x here, and again you will see that it would give the same error जो कि पहले आ रहा था. So private is something that you explicitly write it down. Otherwise, even if you don't write it down explicitly, everything present in a class is private by default. Okay, so let's just take another example, and that example is that now you can use pointers also in order to access the functions and the variables that are present here. So आप pointer notation भी use कर सकते हैं. So firstly you declare the object p, which is an object of class point, and then we can define, let's say, pointer of type point, static PTR, and then initialization has been done with an object P. So PTR is there. So now if I use PTR and I have to use the dot, I mean the arrow notation in this particular case. uh, let's see whether this works or not. ठीक है. So again this will not work because x is a private member, so you can't really do that. ठीक है, आप set के through उसको कर सकते हैं. तो here you can use, let's say, ptr this, and then you can call this function. Similarly बाकी functions को भी आप ऐसे call कर सकते हैं. तो I'll just comment this out for a while ताकि उसको आप print कर सकें. I can also like comment this out just to make it a bit simpler. P की जगह you will have to write down ptr in order to access this. Let's just run this and you will see कि यहाँ पे you will getting an error here because I've just commented with a single line, and now you can see that it actually works. तो आपने set x को भी कॉल कर लिया और ptr को भी आपने print को भी कॉल कर दिया through a pointer notation that we have got. ठीक है जी. तो पॉइंटर नोटेशन के साथ भी आप इसको जो है वो कॉल कर सकते हैं. तो नाउ आई थिंक इट मेक्स इट वेरी क्लियर कि सेटर्स और गेटर्स को की रिक्वायरमेंट क्यों है. सेटर्स एंड गेटर्स की प्राइमरीली रिक्वायरमेंट इसलिए है क्योंकि क्लासेस में अगर आप प्राइवेट मेंबर्स को एक्सेस करना चाहते हैं, रिट्रीव करना चाहते हैं या सेट करना चाहते हैं, उसके लिए आपको फंक्शंस की ज़रूरत पेश आएगी. एंड दैट्स वाई सेटर्स एंड गेटर्स आर एक्चुअली डिफाइंड. Okay, so that should be very I mean that would be very much clear in your mind कि ये क्यों ऐसा है. Okay, so let's take another simple example. और इस simple example के अंदर हम क्या कर रहे हैं. Here we are writing down a small program, and what is this program doing. ये program एक function call करता है, and I'll just write down here. So let me just write down this function here. Okay, so this function has been defined here. I mean a class has been defined here. It's the same, or इसमें integer r and I has been defined. R would represent the real part of a complex number, and I would represent the imaginary part of a complex number. और फिर हमने functions दो define किए हैं, read function और print function, और फिर sum function. Sum function क्या करता है, ये takes in two complex objects of a class complex and adds them up. By adding it means कि दोनों की respective r values को वो add कर दे और दोनों numbers के complex numbers की respective integer values को वो add कर दे. और definition of read has been defined here. ठीक है, definition of print has been defined here, लेकिन definition of sum has not been defined. So I'll just define the definition of sum. So here is the definition of sum. ठीक है, तो ये तीनों functions की definitions जो है ना outside the program has been defined. So this is complex, this is print, and this is sum. ठीक है जी. And now I'll write down the main program. और main program में क्या होगा, main program में ये होगा कि I'll just okay. So it takes, we define three different numbers, I mean objects of class complex C1, C2 and C3. C1 को read करते हैं, C2 को read करते हैं. ठीक है, we read C1 and we read C2, and then we add C1 and C2 together. That means कि C1 का जो R है real part है, that adds to the real part of C2, or imaginary of C1 adds to the imaginary of C2, and as a result we get a new object C3 which is also of the type complex. ठीक है, और उसके लिए हमने ये function sum इसमें दिया हुआ. Now what do you think would this program compile? And if this program doesn't compile, then what's wrong with this program? I mean, I'll just take you over this program that is also given on slide number 11 of the slides. So this is the definition of the class itself. ठीक है जी. Then these are the definitions of the functions, three functions. ठीक है. Can you figure out the problem with this function, with these definitions of the function? ठीक है. Will this compile or not? You should try to find out कि क्या ये compile करेगा ये program या नहीं करेगा, और अगर compile नहीं करता तो क्यों नहीं करेगा. तो that should be clear in your mind. ठीक है. क्यों ये compile नहीं करेगा? Why is it? Why will it not compile? ठीक है. Now the reason for that is कि जब आप definition of a function, okay, so let me just run this. Let me just see कि if I run this program, what would happen in this case is कि अच्छा इसको मैं थोड़ा सा, क्योंकि I have actually copied it from somewhere, तो इसकी इसकी वजह से इसके ये जो integers हैं, I mean ये जो double quotes हैं, they are not in the correct form, so they'll give you an error. ठीक है. एक तो error मैंने इसमें से remove कर दिया. Then what else is the error that needs to be removed? Okay, so let's just run this and you will see that this would generate problem. Okay, so this would generate a problem. The reason for that is कि आपने definition of functions जो है ना वो proper नहीं की. You need to write down the return type here, which is void. ठीक है. ये दोनों functions की definition void. It says return type void, और यहाँ पे जब आप उसको define कर रहे हैं functions को, वहाँ पे आपने उसकी return types जो है ना, those return types have not been mentioned. ठीक है. So that should be very clear. अच्छा, let me just see कि whether this program compiles now or not. अच्छा, it still says कि c1 dot read जो है that actually gives you an error. ठीक है. And why is that? ठीक है. So you should be clear about that कि ये क्यों ऐसा हो रहा है. ठीक है. Though it's a public member, और यहाँ से it's actually saying कि C1 जो है it's actually not compiling. ठीक है. So the reason for that should be clear. Let me make a small change here and see कि आप ये compile करता है या नहीं करता. And here you go, it compiles. ठीक है. और I capital है, let me just make it small I, लेकिन it really doesn't matter in this particular case. The code is running, so let me just enter the real value part 2, and then I enter the imaginary part, let's say 3, and now the second complex number उसका मैं imaginary और real part enter करता हूँ, and now you can see that the real and imaginary part of the added numbers are given, which is C3. उसकी value अब आपको यहाँ पे मिल रही है. तो just keep an eye on this call that is on line number 43. So C3 is a complex object, is an object of type complex, and that's calling this function sum. So the argument is C1 and C2, which is also an object of type complex, right? So this code is also available on the slide, so you can actually run this code and see कि किस तरीके से आप उसको run करना है. It's not very difficult to understand. Okay, so also there is also one more thing that I would like you to remember in this case, or test out yourself in this case, and that is कि क्या the sequence in which you describe these private and public members, does this sequence really matter. ठीक है. तो one small exercise that you can do is कि आप इसके sequence को change करके देख सकते हैं. For example, मैं private members की definition को यहाँ से उठा के declaration को यहाँ से उठा के मैं public members के बाद लगा दूँ. ठीक है. So will that change anything? या अगर मैं अब यहाँ से प्राइवेट 19 लाइन नंबर 19 से प्राइवेट को रिमूव करता हूँ, तो विल दैट मेक एनीथिंग, विल दैट चेंज एनीथिंग? और अगर मैं जब ये पब्लिक से ऊपर था तब मैं ये प्राइवेट रिमूव करता, तो विल दैट मेक एनी चेंज और एनी डिफरेंस? ठीक है, सो दीज आर ऑल डिफरेंट वेरिएशंस सीक्वेंसेस इन विच द पब्लिक एंड द प्राइवेट मेंबर्स हैव बीन डिक्लेयर्ड। उसको इट चेक्स आउट, इट फाइंड्स आउट कि ये इम्पोर्टेंट है या नहीं है. इन दिस पर्टिकुलर केस यू सी दैट इट्स रियली इज नॉट दैट इम्पोर्टेंट. ठीक है, so the sequence is not really important, uh, but you have to keep this thing in mind कि public के बाद अगर आप private members define कर रहे हैं तो the private keyword cannot be skipped. ठीक है, so that has to be very clear in your mind. Okay, with this I'll end today's recording, and that is just an initial version of the class types. In the next discussion, we'll talk about pointers and how to use pointers in defining or in retrieving these members, and then later on we'll discuss about some more advanced concepts that are related to constructors, related to classes. Thank you very much. Bye bye.